We're going to read this morning from the book of Genesis in chapter 14. Genesis in chapter 14. Now, maybe whenever we're reading through the book of Genesis and we come to chapter 14, we'll be very, very tempted to skip on by it because there's so many big names in this chapter. I appreciate a volunteer, but I suppose one of the advantages is that no matter if we pronounce these words right or wrong, well, I'll probably not be noticed, I'm sure. But I have like a word pronunciation in my Bible here. I'm not saying I always get it right, but we'll see how it goes anyway. Genesis chapter 14 at verse 1. And it came to pass in the days of Amphirahel, king of Shinar, Arahak, king of Elasar, Chedorlaomer, king of Elam, and Tidal, king of nations, that these made war with Bera, king of Sodom, and with Birsha, king of Gomorrah, Shinab, king of Admah, and Shemabear, king of Zidom, and the king of Bela, which is Zoar. All these were joined together in the vale of Sidon, which is the Salt Sea. 12 years they served Chedorlaomer, and in the 13th year they rebelled. And in the 14th year came Chedorlaomer, and the kings that were with him, and smote the Rephaims, and Asanoth, Caranim, and the Zumans, and Ham, and the Emmons, and Shavnah, Kerethaman, and the Horites in their Mount Seir, unto Elparan, which is by the wilderness. And they returned and came to Enmishpat, which is Kadesh, and smote all the country of the Amalekites, and also of the Amorites that dwelt in Hazar Tamar. And there went out the king of Sodom, and the king of Gomorrah, and the king of Admah, and the king of Zerabon, and the king of Bela, the same as Zoar, and they joined battle with them in the vale of Sidon, with Chedorlaomer, the king of Elam, and with Tidal, king of nations, and Amphirahel, king of Shinar, and Arahak, king of Elasar, 4 kings with 5. And the vale of Sidon, was full of slime pits. And the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah fled and fell there, and they that remained fled to the mountain. And they took all the goods of Sodom and Gomorrah, and all their victuals, and went their way. And they took Lot, Abraham's brother's son, who dwelt in Sodom, and his goods, and departed. And there came one that had escaped and told Abraham the Hebrew, for he dwelt in the plain of Mamre the Amorite, brother of Escol, and brother of Aner, and these were confederate with Abram. And when Abram heard that his brother was taken captive, he armed his trained servants born in his own house, 318, and pursued them unto Dan. And he divided himself against them, he and his servants by night, and smote them, and pursued them unto Horbah, which is on the left hand of Damascus. And he brought back all the goods, and also brought again his brother Lot, and his goods, and the women also, and the people. Now it's especially these next verses that I want you to try to take a mental note of. Verse 17. And the king of Sodom went out to meet him after his return from the slaughter of Chedorlaomer, and of the kings that were with him at the valley of Shaveh, which is the king's deal. And Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought forth bread and wine, and he was the priest of the Most High God. And he blessed him and said, Blessed be Abram, of the Most High God, possessor of heaven and earth. And blessed be the Most High God, which hath delivered thine enemies into thy hand, and he gave him tithes of all. And the king of Sodom said unto Abram, Give me the persons, and take the goods to thyself. And Abram said to the king of Sodom, I have lifted up mine hand unto the Lord, the Most High, the possessor of heaven and earth, that I will not take from a thread even to a shoe latchet, and that I will not take anything that is thine, lest thou shouldst say, I have made Abram rich, save only that which the young men have eaten, and the portion of the men which were with me, Aner, Escol, and Mamre, let them take their portion. And we know that God will bless his word to our hearts again this morning. And I realise so much so, well, here's a chapter in the Scriptures that probably I'm as guilty as anyone else of passing on by. Seems to me a very complicated chapter, especially with all these big names and this war that was taking place. And it's the latter part of the chapter that maybe is more easily understood. But for the benefit of those of you that maybe haven't been with us last Lord's Day, or maybe you've missed a Sunday or two, or you're visiting with us, the background of the story that we've been looking at is this man, the patriarch Abraham, and how one day that whenever he's living in the midst of idolatry, God comes and reveals himself to him, and Abraham starts out in this walk, the walk of faith. Where we've left Abraham at was last week, whenever we looked at the subject of the choices and the consequences that both of these men made. Not only was there Abraham, but there was also his nephew Lot. And we have dwelt upon the fact that Lot was not part of the call. Lot was never called of God. It was Abraham that had received the call to leave his father Terah and to go out at the bidding of God. But what we've been dwelling on is the fact that he partially obeyed. And last week, maybe most of the time was spent on this man Lot, Abraham's nephew, and the choices that this man made and the consequences as a result. We did say last week that Abraham was the man who is known as the father of the faithful. He's the man of faith. We have Lot, and he was a man that lived by sight. He saw all the plain. And what he was more interested was that the plains were well watered, that there was plenty of provision for his cattle, but he never asked the question, would this be a good place to bring up my family? We did conclude last week and say the story of Lot is a very, very sad, tragic story. How a spiritual man became a helpless drunkard. I was reading in my own quiet time yesterday, I was reading about the awful sin that this man committed with his two daughters. As to how one day Lot got drunk, and both his own daughters were pregnant by their own father. And that was a tragedy. And we reckon, of course, that maybe some of these things is only around in more recent years. But you've only to read the Bible to realise that these things are nothing new. And as a result, well, you had two races that were going to be born. There was the Moabites, and also there was the Amorites. The sad picture, how a spiritual man fell. We noticed also that Lot became influential in the government of Sodom, as to how he sat at the gate of the Sodom. He was no doubt in the inner council. But then we leave Lot for a moment or two, and we come back to this man Abraham. And Abraham also made a choice. We're told as to how God came to him, and God revealed to him again his promise that he would give to him the whole land. He also gave to him a new position in his family, because Abraham is the man who is going to command his children after the ways of God. But where we break into this story here in chapter 14, there's a political situation has arisen. And in chapter 14 is the first time that we read about war in the Bible. And this political situation is in those first few verses that we've read, as to how that we had eventually two kings that are going to, or 9 kings altogether rather, that are going to go out to war. We see that simply there was one nation going to line up against another nation to protect its own interests. You had 4 kings from the east who are going out to fight the 5 kings from the plain. We may just draw our attention today that in chapter 14, in the Word of God here, we find that not only is war mentioned for the first time, but in chapter 14 we read about a priest for the first time. We read about a king, we read about bread, and we read about tithing, and all those are found in Genesis chapter 14. Now the background to this story is that Sodom had been a tributary of King Chedorlaomer for 12 years. For 12 years they've paid their taxes. For 12 years they have in some measure been maybe living in a very much in their bondage. But in year 13 they rebelled. And after they rebelled, there was the result, which was Chedorlaomer, along with his confederates, they invaded Canaan to deal with these rebellious people. And we're told as to how Lot was captured and his possessions. And after Abraham has heard about his nephew being captured, he decides to go out to war. Now, last week we did cover as to how that this man Lot never thought of his uncle Abraham. And I imagine the natural response would have been, well, Lot is captured. Lot is reaping what he has sown. Let Lot stay there. Let Lot even perish there. But Abraham didn't. And as a result, he goes out to war, and there's this man, Chedorlaomer, who is a dictator from Persia, which is now West Pakistan. And he decides that the best place for this battle is the Valley of Sidon. And if your Bible is like my Bible, there's a little cross-reference about these slime pits. These slime pits were literally tar pits. And they reckon that this is where the battle will take place. And so we find that after Abraham notices that Lot is captured, he's still determined to rescue him. He gets 318 of his best trained men, and he goes out here to battle. And that's where I want to leave the war today. And I want to move on into the next section of the Word of God. But that's just a little summary of those verses about those 9 kings who were going out to war. Where I want to break into this story, and I'll use it under the heading today, the test of success. And we will usually find, dear friends, that success comes at a price. And here is a man, Abraham, and I want us to notice this morning, and just to take note, how this man dealt with success. And whether it's promotion in business, whether it's promotion in whatever field that we could go down this morning, we will notice that there's that test that will come to us. We have Abraham here, and Abraham is coming back from the war. He has won a great victory. He's a man that is very, very excited. But now he's going to be tested. And I want to point out this morning what I pointed out at the very start of the story of Abraham a few weeks ago, that we're never as more vulnerable to an attack of the enemy than when God has been blessing us. And I used the illustration as to how that whenever Jesus was baptized, that immediately after his baptism, the devil attacked him. And out into the wilderness he went to be tempted of Satan. Abraham is rather excited here, but he's in a vulnerable position. We can think of the story of Elijah on Mount Carmel, where Elijah saw those prophets of Baal slaughtered. But then we notice as to how we find Elijah, and he's sitting under a juniper tree, and he's so depressed that he requests that he might die. I want to draw our attention, dear friends, this morning that Lot has been rescued. Abraham, the uncle, is feeling very, very good about it. But on his way home, he's intercepted by a visitor. And these are the visitors. There's 2 visitors that I want us to notice today. 2 different kings that met with him. We have a spiritual battle, we could say, because they're 2 opposites. There's the defeat of the 4 kings, and these 2 kings now are going to have an encounter with Abraham. One of them is from the sinful city of Sodom. The other is the king of Salem, Melchizedek, the king of peace. And he's going to have an encounter with him also. How subtle we find here in the early chapters of the Word of God. We're going to go back to chapter 3 of the story of the Garden of Eden to see how subtle the enemy really is. Abraham's feeling so good. The city has been captured. And so on his way home, he meets in verse 21 the king of Sodom. And the king of Sodom says to Abraham, we'll do something here. Give me the people back that you've captured. And you give me the people that you've captured back, and what I'll do to you is I'll give to you all the goods that has been captured. This is the agreement that we'll come to. He says, I want these people back again. Dear friends, today on the surface, this all sounded a very good deal. This sounded a very good bargain. After all, he's going to be rewarded for his bravery. He has risked his life. Everyone understands that the victor will become the man who owns the spoils. It all sounds so good. Take the money, go back home again. It's all fine. Now, you don't need me to stand up here this morning to tell us that money talks. And if money was standing here in this pulpit this morning, I could tell all sorts of stories. Where it is led into, where it is led out of. One day, whenever I was in hospital visiting, I met a wee man that I didn't know, but I noticed the surname. And I went over to talk to him. And he started telling me about his church. And he told me about how that they had just built a new parish hall, and told me the cost of the hall. It was quite a big cost. And then he said to me, he says, when it's all paid for, and all the rest of it, and the parish was taking all the brags for it. So after the little man had finished talking, I said to him, I think I read in the paper one day that you've got a substantial sum from the lottery. And the wee man started to laugh. And he says, well, that's right. And I want to say, dear friends, that even the lottery money, it is bought into places where it ought never to have been. And I'll just say that in passing. That money talks, money tells stories, money changes situations. There's not a doubt about that. And so the first temptation that this man, Abraham, is going to meet with, he's coming home from war, he's so excited how he has won the battle. But the king of Sodom, well, we could say nearly he was a type of Satan. He was from the most sinful place out. The king of Sodom, well, he just says, Abraham, you take all the possessions and give me back the people, and that's the agreement that we'll come to. We'll strike this compromise, and then everything will work out. Sounds good. Don't worry about the fact that it's coming from the king of Sodom. But I want you, dear friends, to notice this morning and to learn from this, because at the final analysis in the story of Abraham, we have to look at what is the practical implications for us as believers if we take the name of Christ with us. And I want you to notice in this test of faith, we have this man, Abraham's conviction. He didn't waver. And he says to the king of Sodom in verse 22, I have lifted up mine hand unto the Lord, the Most High, God, the possessor of heaven and earth. And he says, I'm not going to take anything. I'm a man of conviction. He says, I've raised my hand unto God. And I want to point out this morning that this was in the past tense. This just didn't happen whenever he was returning from the battle. He says, I've raised my hand. This statement here is not raising his hand actually now. He has already done it to God, away in the past. In fact, we'll come to it in a moment or two. I ask you today, do you have a set of convictions that you know what to do whenever a temptation comes? As a believer this morning, what are your boundaries? How far will your boundaries move whenever temptation comes? I told a story in the prayer meeting the other night about this man who was a top surgeon. And one day, someone comes to him and offers him a new post. And they said to him, well, this new post here, you're going to be earning a vast sum of money. He was going to earn so much, he was only earning a fraction of it before. The surgeon, he decided, well, what I'll do is I'll test the job first. I'll give it a week and then I'll make up my mind whether this job is for me or not. And the story went on, as I shared on Thursday night in the prayer meeting, the story went on as to how this surgeon, he said he got up at 6 o'clock in the morning, first morning. He wasn't finishing till near 11 o'clock at night. And he did that the first day, and he did it the second day, and he did it the third day. And after the third day, he came to the one who had invited him to the job, and he says, look, I'm sorry here, but this post is not for me. And the folks said to him, well, how come? Look how far you've come. Look how much money you're going to earn in comparison to what you've already been earning. No, he says, I don't think this post is for me. He says, from I've started in this temporary for this week, I haven't even had time for a quiet time. And so he thanked them for the offer of the post, and he went back to his own job. Now, I would say that man had boundaries in his life. And dear friends, we'll never get very far through life if we haven't a set of boundaries, a set of convictions. How far would you go today in a business deal? How far would you go to compromise your faith? This man had the courage to say no. He looked at the temptation. He looked at the nature of it. There was nothing really wrong with taking a gift from the king of Sodom. Many people would have said that to him. But I want you to know, dear friends, that the reason why he didn't take the gift from the king of Sodom was, well did Abraham know that if he accepted this gift, then the king of Sodom would have control over him. And whenever the king of Sodom would realize that he's in a tight spot, he'll be able to say to Abraham, well, look, Abraham, we have come to this compromise. You took the goods and I took the people. And so Abraham knew all that. And so he looks at it all and he says, no, I'll not even take a shoelace from you. He had the courage of his convictions. How he had been held in bondage to the king of Sodom. Well did everybody around him know that if there's one person he didn't want anything to do with, it was the king of Sodom. From the most wicked, sinful place out. But dear friends, Abraham made no room for maneuver here. There was no room for compromise. Do you ever, maybe even we could be guilty of it, of saying no, but then we lay all these conditions, and by the time we do all that, we really said yes. He says, I have raised my hand unto the Most High God. And the word here for God is Elyon, possessor of heaven and earth. And friends, today, whenever God was Abraham's friend, he didn't need a shoelace from the king of Sodom. He was going to serve God. Like the 3 Hebrew children, he was going to say, well, even if God doesn't deliver me, I'll still trust in him. He has raised his hand unto God. What are your boundaries today? What are my boundaries? What is my set of principles or my set of convictions this morning? Can we look back and say, I've raised my hand to God, that I remember the place, the time whenever I said, well, look, God, I'll stand for you should I stand alone? I always think of those 2 Roman Catholic teachers that I knew down in the south of Ireland, and it cost them their jobs because they refused to teach some of the things that they were going to have to teach. That's what it cost them, and that's, dear knows, 27, 28 years now. He has raised his hand unto God. Dear friend, I'm glad that there was not only one king that he met with, but there was also another king that he met with. One was the king of Sodom, the other was the king of Salem, this man Melchizedek. Now, I wouldn't like to be asked to spell him, this morning. And even every time I would go out, I don't know how good our spellings would be, but I'm glad that I'm not asked to spell them. And even with my own notes, I'm sure my spelling's completely wrong because spelling's never a strong point. And I used some abbreviations. But this here was the priest of the Most High God, the king of Salem, which became Jerusalem. Now, the Bible's very silent. I don't know, not only if we were asked to spell him, as to whether we passed the test or not. I wonder if we were given a little test as to who this man Melchizedek really is, as to how far we could go with him. And maybe in our meeting this morning, he's a man that maybe you've glanced over before, but you've never actually stopped to see, who is this man, the king of Salem, this man Melchizedek? Well, if we want any more information on him, we have to go to the Psalms and also to the book of Hebrews and chapter 7. But I'll give you a very brief summary about this man, Melchizedek. He was a real person. And in theological circles, there's been a lot of discussion over the years as to who actually this man is. But we can conclude from Hebrews chapter 7, he was a real person. The second thing was he was made like unto the Son of God. He's a man who had no beginning and no end, we're told. He's the King of peace. He's the King of God. He's certainly a picture of the Lord Jesus Christ in the Old Testament. Melchizedek here was like Christ standing before Abraham after Abraham has come back from the battle. And he has had this contest, first of all, with the king of Sodom. And he says, look, I want nothing to do with you. But there's this second king, the king of blessing, the king of Salem. Melchizedek here, who was a type of Christ, confronting Abraham on the road to temptation. You see, this was a big temptation for this man. Dear friends, there's many temptations out there for you and I. I don't know what your aspirations are, even for your family, if they're still around you. I'm sure that you have your own goals that may not be their goals. But I certainly have always taken the route, I would rather see them, dear friend, doing a very menial task in the will of God and walking with God, than to push ahead through life and not walk in the ways of God. Melchizedek, we're told here some things about him in verse 18. And Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought forth bread and wine, and he was the priest of the Most High God, and he blessed him. And he said, Blessed be Abram of the Most High God, possessor of heaven and earth. Melchizedek ministered to Abraham before the king of Sodom came. He measured to him physically, we're told, with bread and with wine. He ministered to him personally because he called him by name. And he says, Blessed be Abram of the Most High God, the possessor of heaven and earth, after he's blessed him. He ministers to him spiritually because he reminds him that he's serving Elion, which is the Most High God, the possessor of heaven and earth. Temptation was going to come. And may I say, friends, this morning that maybe as a believer, temptation is going to come to you. And temptation is going to come to me. And God sends people, maybe even before temptation comes, to try to stop us and to try to direct us. Temptation will come to us all. How often it comes from unexpected sources, it comes at unexpected times. But it will come. God will provide us with a way of escape when temptation comes. Sometimes we're so insensitive maybe to temptation and to the voice of God even, that we miss the mark. Times maybe whenever God has brought someone along to your path because you're about to be tested. This man here, Melchizedek, the king of Salem, this real person, this type of Christ. And with this I'll close, dear friends, this morning. We have Abraham's choice along it all. In verse 23, that I will not take from a thread even to a shoe latchet, that I will not take anything that is thine, lest thou shouldst say, I have made Abraham rich. Along life's road, you and I have choices to make. And we make choices every day along the route of life. And I know that we could ask ourselves the question this morning, and I'm sure many of us do, how did this man here, this man Abraham, the man who was willing to let his wife go to somebody else, how did this man change so much that he has come to the place here where he says, I've lifted up my hand to the Most High God, the maker of heaven and earth? I believe it was because Abraham made a choice in life. He may not have had a high group of people around him. It's many years ago that, well, I counted a privilege. Back in 1980, which is 30 years ago now, I counted a privilege, looking back, to have been able to go out amongst the tents and sit in tents the way that Abraham would have lived. And how that his tent would have been moved to one place to another. And I'll say this, that Abraham here, from he came up out of Egypt, he's always had time for the altar. And I would ask you, dear friends, this morning, have you time for God? Have you time to take time with God, to learn about God, to learn about his ways? Yes, he's a busy man, but he has time for God. Lot also made his choice. He was busy too. He was sitting at the inner council. He was sitting at the gate. He's so busy he had no time for God. I've heard some people say, and I'm inclined to agree with you, I have 3 lads of my own. And I'm sure our families will look at life a lot different from the way that we did. And maybe you look at life and say, well, whenever I was young, I had to work and I had to do this, that, and the other thing. But maybe some young people will look at it, well, there's actually more to life than just that. Do I realise that the importance and certainly the ethic of work have been taught even to children? Never to hand everything on a plate, because it's the ruination, no doubt, if we went down that route. Absolute ruination. But I say this, dear friend, this man had a choice to make. And our young people will constantly make choices. Choices in life. I hear some of my nephews and nieces talk about heading off. They're going to do a bit of travelling and taking a year out and doing this, that, and the other thing. And of course, to the previous generation, that was unheard of. You didn't do things like that. Maybe some of us look and say, well, life's too short, nearly, if you're interested in those things, not to do it. But the test of success, maybe you're going to have success in life. Dear friend, be aware that it could come at a price. The test of it, Abraham had learned to say no because he had raised his hand to the high King of heaven. May God bless his word to our hearts today.